Washington and Rochambeau discussed their options. Washington wanted to attack the British in New York, and Rochambeau wanted to attack them in Virginia, where Cornwallis's forces were less established. 254. Washington eventually gave way, and Lafayette took a combined Franco-American force into Virginia. 255. Clinton misinterpreted his movements as preparations for an attack on New York and instructed Cornwallis to establish a fortified sea base, where the Royal Navy could evacuate British troops to help defend New York. 256. When Lafayette entered Virginia, Cornwallis complied with Clinton's orders and withdrew to Yorktown, where he constructed strong defenses and awaited evacuation. 257. An agreement by the Spanish Navy to defend the French West Indies allowed Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse to relocate to the Atlantic seaboard, a move Arbuthnot did not anticipate. 252. This provided Lafayette naval support. While the failure of previous combined operations at Newport and Savannah meant their coordination was planned more carefully. 258. Despite repeated urging from his subordinates, Cornwallis made no attempt to engage Lafayette before he could establish siege lines. 259. Expecting to be withdrawn within a few days, he also abandoned the outer defenses, which were promptly occupied by the besiegers and hastened British defeat. 260. On August 31, a Royal Navy fleet under Thomas Graves left New York for Yorktown. 261. After landing troops and munitions for the besiegers on August 30, de Grasse remained in Chesapeake Bay and intercepted him on September 5. Although the Battle of the Chesapeake was indecisive in terms of losses, Graves was forced to retreat, leaving Cornwallis isolated. 262. An attempted breakout over the York River at Gloucester Point failed due to bad weather. 263. Under heavy bombardment with dwindling supplies, on October 16 Cornwallis sent emissaries to General Washington to negotiate surrender. After 12 hours of negotiations, the terms of surrender were finalized the following day. 264. Responsibility for defeat was the subject of fierce public debate between Cornwallis, Clinton, and Jermyn. Clinton ultimately took most of the blame and spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. 265. Subsequent to Yorktown, American forces were assigned to supervise the armistice between Washington and Clinton, made to facilitate British departure following the January 1782 Law of Parliament forbidding any further British offensive action in North America. British-American negotiations in Paris led to signed preliminary agreements in November 1782, which acknowledged U.S. independence. The enacted Congressional War objective, a British withdrawal from North America and cession of these regions to the U.S., was completed in stages in East Coast cities. 266. In the U.S. South, Generals Greene and Wayne observed the British removing their troops from Charleston on December 14, 1782. 267. Loyalist provincial militias of whites and free blacks and loyalists with slaves were transported to Nova Scotia and the British West Indies. A.e. Native American allies of the British and some freed blacks were left to escape unaided through the American lines. On April 9, 1783, Washington issued orders that all acts of hostility were to cease immediately. That same day, by arrangement with Washington, Carleton issued a similar order to British troops. 268. As directed by a congressional resolution of May 26, 1783, all non-commissioned officers and enlisted were furloughed to their homes until the definitive treaty of peace, when they would be automatically discharged. The U.S. armies were directly disbanded in the field as of Washington's general orders on June 2, 1783. 269. Once the Treaty of Paris was signed with Britain on September 3, 1783, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. 266. The last British occupation of New York City ended on November 25, 1783, with the departure of Clinton's replacement. General Sir Guy Carleton, 270. Strategy and Commanders. West Point Military Academy Map of America east of the Mississippi River. Campaigns noted in New England. In the Middle Colonies with 3 British red sailing ship naval victories. In the South with 2 British naval victories. And in Virginia with 1 French blue sailing ship naval victory. A timeline bar graph below shows almost all British red bar victories on the left in the first half of the war, and almost all U.S. blue bar victories on the right in the second half of the war. A map of principal campaigns in the American Revolutionary War 271, with British movements in red and American movements in blue. The timeline shows the British won most battles in the war's first half, but Americans won the most in the second. To win their insurrection, Washington and the Continental Army needed to outlast the British will to fight. To restore British America, the British had to defeat the Continental Army quickly and compel the Second Continental Congress to retract its claim to self-governance. 272. Historian Terry M. Mays of the Citadel identifies 3 separate types of warfare during the Revolutionary War. The first was a colonial conflict in which objections to imperial trade regulation were as significant as taxation policy. The second was a civil war between American patriots, American loyalists, and those who preferred to remain neutral. Particularly in the South, many battles were fought between patriots and loyalists with no British involvement, leading to divisions that continued after independence was achieved. 273. The third element was a global war between France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Britain, with America serving as one of several different war theaters. 273. After entering the Revolutionary War in 1778, France provided the Americans money, weapons, soldiers, and naval assistance, while French troops fought under U.S. command in North America. While Spain did not formally join the war in America, they provided access to the Mississippi River and captured British possessions on the Gulf of Mexico that denied bases to the Royal Navy, retook Minorca, and besieged Gibraltar in Europe. 274. Although the Dutch Republic was no longer a major power prior to 1774, they still dominated the European carrying trade, and Dutch merchants made large profits by shipping French-supplied munitions to the Patriots. This ended when Britain declared war in December 1780, and the conflict proved disastrous to the Dutch economy. 275. American strategy. The Second Continental Congress stood to benefit if the Revolution evolved into a protracted war. Colonial state populations were largely prosperous and depended on local production for food and supplies rather than on imports from Britain. The 13 colonies were spread across most of North American Atlantic seaboard, stretching 1,000 miles. Most colonial farms were remote from the seaports. And control of 4 or 5 major ports did not give Britain control over American inland areas. Each state had established internal distribution systems. 276. Motivation was also a major asset. Each colonial capital had its own newspapers and printers, and the Patriots enjoyed more popular support than the Loyalists. Britain hoped that the Loyalists would do much of the fighting, but found that the Loyalists did not engage as significantly as they had hoped. Futun. Continental Army. Main article, Continental Army. See also, Militia, United States, Sukpun American Revolutionary War, 1775-1783, and Munutmun. Formal painting of General George Washington, standing in uniform, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. A 1776 portrait of Washington by Charles Wilson Pulla, now housed in the Brooklyn Museum. When the Revolutionary War began, the Second Continental Congress lacked a professional army or navy. However, each of the colonies had a long-established system of local militia, which were combat-tested in support of British regulars in the French and Indian War. The colonial state legislatures independently funded and controlled their local militias. 276. Mulattomen were lightly armed, had little training, and usually did not have uniforms. Their units served for only a few weeks or months at a time and lacked the training and discipline of more experienced soldiers. Local county militias were reluctant to travel far from home and were unavailable for extended upperutpuns. 277. To compensate for this, the Continental Congress established a regular force known as the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, which proved to be the origin of the modern United States Army, and appointed Washington as its commander-in-chief. However, it suffered significantly from the lack of an effective training program and from largely inexperienced officers. 278. Each state legislature appointed officers for both county and state militias and their regimental Continental Line officers. Although Washington was required to accept congressional appointments, he was permitted to choose and command his own generals, such as Grunna, his chief of artillery, Knox, and Alexander Hamilton, the chief of staff. 279. One of Washington's most successful general officer recruits was Steuben, a veteran of the Prussian General Staff who wrote the Revolutionary War drill Menyud. 278. The development of the Continental Army was always a work in progress, and Washington used both his regulars and state militias throughout the war. When properly employed, the combination allowed them to overwhelm smaller British forces, as they did in battles at Concord, Boston, Bennington, and Saratoga. Both sides used partisan warfare, but the state militias effectively suppressed Loyalist activity when British regulars were not in the area. 277. Washington designed the overall military strategy in cooperation with Congress, established the principle of civilian supremacy in military affairs, personally recruited his senior officer corps, and kept the states focused on a common goal. 282. Washington initially employed the inexperienced officers and untrained troops in Fabian strategies rather than risk frontal assaults against Britain's professional forces. 283. Over the course of the war, Washington lost more battles than he won, but he never surrendered his troops and maintained a fighting force in the face of British field armies. 284. By prevailing European standards, the armies in America were relatively small, limited by lack of supplies and logistics. The British were constrained by the logistical difficulty of transporting troops across the Atlantic and their dependence on local supplies. Washington never directly commanded more than 17,000 men, 285, and the combined Franco-American army in the decisive American victory at Yorktown was only about Nunton, 286. At the beginning of 1776, Patriot forces consisted of 20,000 men, with 2/3 in the Continental Army and the other third in the state militias. About 250,000 American men served as regulars or as militia for the revolutionary cause during the war, but there were never more than 90,000 men under arms at any time. 287. On the whole, American officers never equaled their British opponents in tactics and maneuvers, and they lost most of the pitched battles. The great successes at Boston, 1776, Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, 1781, were won by trapping the British far from base with a greater number of troops, 279. After 1778, Washington's army was transformed into a more disciplined and effective force, mostly as a product of Baron von Steuben's military training. 278. Immediately after the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge in June 1778, it proved its ability to match the military capabilities of the British at the Battle of Monmouth, including a Black Rudder Island regiment fending off a British bayonet attack, and then counter-charging the British for the first time as part of Washington's army. 288. After the Battle of Monmouth, Washington came to realize that saving entire towns was not necessary, but preserving his army and keeping the revolutionary spirit alive was more important. Washington informed Henry Laurens, then president of the Second Continental Congress (UG), that the possession of our towns, while we have an army in the field, will avail them little. 290. Although the Continental Congress was responsible for the war effort and provided supplies to the troops, Washington took it upon himself to pressure Congress and the state legislatures to provide the essentials of war. There was never nearly enough. 291 Congress evolved in its committee oversight and established the Board of War, which included members of the Mulata. 292, because the Board of War was also a committee ensnared with its own internal procedures. Congress also created the post of Secretary of War, appointing Major General Benjamin Lincoln to the position in February 1781. Washington worked closely with Lincoln to coordinate civilian and military authorities and took charge of training and supplying the 293-270 Continental Navy. Main articles: Continental Navy and Continental Marines. See also Privateer Sukpun American Revolutionary War and Whaleboat War. Further information: Naval battles of the American Revolutionary War. Sail warships at sea with full sail. In the center middle ground, the U.S. ship. In the background, 4 French warships in a haze giving it a cannon salute with gunpowder. Small boats also in the water in the middle ground. USS Ranger, commanded by Captain John Paul Jones. During the first summer of the war, Washington began outfitting schooners and other small seagoing vessels to prey on ships supplying the British in Boston. 295. The Second Continental Congress established the Continental Navy on October 13, 1775, and appointed Usuk Hupkins as its first command. 295. For most of the war, the Continental Navy included only a handful of small frigates and sloops, supported by privateers. 296. On November 10, 1775, Congress authorized the creation of the Continental Marines, which ultimately evolved into the United States Marine Corps. 281. John Paul Jones became the first American naval hero when he captured HMS Drake on April 24, 1778, the first victory for any American military vessel in British waters. 297. The last such victory was by the frigate USS Alliance, commanded by Captain John Barry. On March 10, 1783, the Alliance outgunned HMS Sybil in a 45-minute duel while escorting Spanish gold from Havana to the Congress in Philadelphia. 298. After Yorktown, all U.S. Navy ships were sold or given away. It was the first time in America's history that it had no fighting forces on the high seas. 299. Congress primarily commissioned privateers to reduce costs and to take advantage of the large proportion of colonial sailors found in the British Empire. In total, they included 1,700 ships that successfully captured 2,283 enemy ships to damage the British effort and to enrich themselves with the proceeds from the sale of cargo and the ship itself. 300 about 55,000 sailors served aboard American privateers during the war. 16. France. Main article: France in the American Revolution. Further information: History of the French Navy section Louis XVI and Military History of France section Ancien Régime. At the beginning of the war, the Americans had no major international allies, since most nation-states waited to see how the conflict unfolded. Over time, the Continental Army established its military credibility. Battles such as the Battle of Bennington, the battles of Saratoga, and even defeats such as the Battle of Germantown proved decisive in gaining the support of powerful European nations, including France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. The Dutch moved from covertly supplying the Americans with weapons and supplies to overtly supporting them, 302. The decisive American victory at Saratoga convinced France, which was already a long-time rival of Britain, to offer the Americans the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. The two nations also agreed to a defensive treaty of alliance to protect their trade and also guaranteed American independence from Britain. To engage the United States as a French ally militarily, the treaty was conditioned on Britain initiating a war on France to stop it from trading with the U.S. Spain and the Dutch Republic were invited to join by both France and the United States in the treaty, but neither was responsive to the request. 303. On June 13, 1778, France declared war on Great Britain, and it invoked the French military alliance with the U.S., which ensured additional U.S. private support for French possessions in the Caribbean. A.I. Washington worked closely with the soldiers and navy that France would send to America, primarily through Lafayette on his staff. French assistance made critical contributions required to defeat Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. 306 ad. British strategy. Further information, 7 Years' War. The British military had considerable experience fighting in North America. 308, however, in previous conflicts they benefited from local logistics and support from the colonial militia. In the American Revolutionary War, reinforcements had to come from Europe, and maintaining large armies over such distances was extremely complex. Ships could take 3 months to cross the Atlantic, and orders from London were often outdated by the time they arrived. 309. Prior to the conflict, the colonies were largely autonomous economic and political entities, with no centralized area of ultimate strategic importance. 310. This meant that, unlike Europe where the fall of a capital city often ended wars, that in America continued even after the loss of major settlements such as Philadelphia, the seat of Congress, New York, and Charleston. 311. British power was reliant on the Royal Navy, whose dominance allowed them to resupply their own expeditionary forces while preventing access to enemy ports. However, the majority of the American population was agrarian, rather than urban. Supported by the French Navy and blockade runners based in the Dutch Caribbean, their economy was able to survive. 312. Lord North, Prime Minister since 1770, delegated control of the war in North America to Lord George German and the Earl of Sandwich, who was head of the Royal Navy from 1771 to 1782. Defeat at Saratoga in 1777 made it clear the revolt would not be easily suppressed, especially after the Franco-American alliance of February 1778. With Spain also expected to join the conflict, the Royal Navy needed to prioritize either the war in America or in Europe. German advocated the former, Sandwich the latter. 313. North initially backed the Southern strategy, attempting to exploit divisions between the mercantile North and slave-owning South, but after the defeat of Yorktown, he was forced to accept that this policy had failed. 314. It was clear the war was lost. Although the Royal Navy forced the French to relocate their fleet to the Caribbean in November 1781 and resumed a close blockade of American trade. 315. The resulting economic damage and rising inflation meant the U.S. was now eager to end the war, while France was unable to provide further loans. Congress could no longer pay its soldiers. 316. The geographical size of the colonies and limited manpower meant the British could not simultaneously conduct military operations and occupy territory without local support. Debate persists over whether their defeat was inevitable. One British statesman described it as like trying to conquer a map. 317. While Furling argues Patriot victory was nothing short of a miracle, 318. Ellis suggests the odds always favored the Americans, especially after Howe squandered the chance of a decisive British success in 1776. An opportunity that would never come again. 319. The U.S. military history speculates the additional commitment of 10,000 fresh troops in 1780 would have placed British victory within the realm of possibility. 320. British Army. Main article: British Army during the American Revolutionary War. See also, Loyalist American Revolution, section Military Service. Portrait of the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Thomas Gage in dress uniform. Sir Thomas Gage, British Army commander from 1763 to 1775. The expulsion of France from North America in 1763 led to a drastic reduction in British troop levels in the colonies. In 1775, there were only 8,500 regular soldiers among a civilian population of 2.8 million, 321. The bulk of military resources in the Americas were focused on defending sugar islands in the Caribbean. Jamaica alone generated more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined. 322. With the end of the 7 Years' War, the permanent army in Britain was also cut back, which resulted in administrative difficulties when the war began a decade later. 323. Over the course of the war, there were 4 separate British commanders-in-chief. The first was Thomas Gage, appointed in 1763, whose initial focus was establishing British rule in former French areas of Canada. Many in London blamed the revolt on his failure to take firm action earlier, and he was relieved after the heavy losses incurred at the Battle of Bunker Hill. 325. His replacement was Sir William Howe, a member of the Whig faction in Parliament who opposed the policy of coercion advocated by Lord North. Cornwallis, who later surrendered at Yorktown, was one of many senior officers who initially refused to serve in North America. 325. The 1775 campaign showed the British overestimated the capabilities of their own troops and underestimated the colonial militia, requiring a reassessment of tactics and strategy. 326, and allowing the Patriots to take the initiative. 327. Howe's responsibility is still debated. Despite receiving large numbers of reinforcements, Bunker Hill seems to have permanently affected his self-confidence, and lack of tactical flexibility meant he often failed to follow up opportunities. 328. Many of his decisions were attributed to supply problems, such as his failure to pursue Washington's beaten 329. Having lost the confidence of his subordinates, he was recalled after Bugana surrendered at Saratoga. 330. Following the failure of the Carlisle Commission, British policy changed from treating the Patriots as subjects who needed to be reconciled to enemies who had to be defeated. 331. In 1778, Howe was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. 332, regarded as an expert on tactics, and like his predecessors, Clinton was handicapped by chronic supply issues. 333. In addition, Clinton's strategy was compromised by conflict with political superiors in London and his colleagues in North America, especially Admiral Merritt Arbuthnot. Replaced in early 1781 by Rudna. 252, he was neither notified nor consulted when Germany approved Cornwallis's invasion of the South in 1781, and delayed sending him reinforcements, believing the bulk of Washington's army was still outside New York City. 335. After the surrender at Yorktown, Clinton was relieved by Cudton, whose major task was to oversee the evacuation of Loyalists and British troops from Savannah, Charleston, and New York City. 335. German troops. Main article: Hessian soldier. Hessian troops surrender after Battle of Trenton, December 1776. Hessian troops surrender after Washington's victory at the Battle of Trenton in December 1776. During the 18th century, states commonly hired foreign soldiers, including Britain. 336. When it became clear additional troops were needed to suppress the revolt in America, it was decided to employ professional German soldiers. There were several reasons for this, including public sympathy for the Patriot cause, a historical reluctance to expand the British Army, and the time needed to recruit and train new regiments. 337. Many smaller states in the Holy Roman Empire had a long tradition of renting their armies to the highest bidder. The most important was Hesse-Kassel, known as the mercenary Stadt. 330. The first supply agreements were signed by the North administration in late 1775. 30,000 Germans served in the American War. 339, often generically referred to as Hessians. They included men from many other states, including Hanover and Brunswick. 340, Sir Henry Clinton recommended recruiting Russian troops whom he rated very highly, having seen them in action against the Ottomans. However, negotiations with Catherine the Great made little progress. 341. Unlike previous wars, their use led to intense political debate in Britain, France, and even Germany, where Frederick the Great refused to provide passage through his territories for troops hired for the American War. 342. In March 1776, the agreements were challenged in Parliament by Whigs who objected to coercion in general and the use of foreign soldiers to subdue British subjects. 343. The debates were covered in detail by American newspapers. In May 1776, they received copies of the treaties themselves, provided by British sympathizers and smuggled into North America from London. 344. The prospect of foreign German soldiers being used in the colonies bolstered support for independence, more so than taxation and other acts combined. The king was accused of declaring war on his own subjects, leading to the idea there were now two separate governments. 346. By apparently showing Britain was determined to go to war, it made hopes of reconciliation seem naive and hopeless. While the employment of what was regarded as foreign mercenaries became one of the charges leveled against George III in the Declaration of Independence. 342. The Hessian reputation within Germany for brutality also increased support for the Patriot cause among German-American immigrants. 347. The presence of over 150,000 German Americans meant both sides felt the German soldiers might be persuaded to desert. One reason Clinton suggested employing Russians was that he felt they were less likely to defect. When the first German troops arrived on Staten Island in August 1776, Congress approved the printing of handbills, promising land and citizenship to any willing to join the Patriot cause. The British launched a counter-campaign claiming deserters could be executed. 340. Desertion among the Germans occurred throughout the war, with the highest rate of desertion occurring between the surrender at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. 340 non-German regiments were central to the British war effort. Of the estimated 30,000 sent to America, some 13,000 became casualties. 350.